Alrighty, welcome to another exciting lecture, and here today we'll turn our attention to the second half of our story of politics in the 1820s and 1830s. Here we're going to examine now the period where Andrew Jackson is president. In our previous lecture on this topic, we examined the political changes that made it possible for the ascendance of Andrew Jackson. A new age of universal white manhood suffrage, a new party system, a new political culture that centered on mass participation. All that leads to Jackson's victory in the election of 1828. Now we turn our attention here in this lecture to what Jackson does in office. One of the key developments in this period is the development of another two-party system, another two-party rivalry. During the era of good feelings, there was once again one-party rule, but for all the reasons we enunciated on the previous lecture, from the election of 1824 onward, there would now be a new two-party system that would end the era of good feelings and revive that element of American political history and life, the two-party rivalry. In this period of the Jacksonian era, the two-party rivalry is one between the Democrats, the party founded by Jackson after that corrupt bargain, in his estimation, of the election of 1824, and the Whig Party. The Whig Party was formed after the Democratic Party as sort of a counter to the growing political force that surrounded Andrew Jackson. When it comes to this two-party rivalry, this second two-party system of Democrats versus Whigs, the debates of this period between the two parties centered on the major trend in American economics, the Industrial Revolution, the market revolution, those economic trends that we talked about in a recent lecture. So further proof that the key factor in American life in the early 1800s is this economic shift, these economic trends that we've discussed. Further proof that those economic changes are key is the fact that the political system, the political order, the two-party system of this period centered on those economic changes. The most crucial political concerns, the most crucial political arguments, the most crucial political issues all stemmed from the market revolution, industrialization. They concerned issues of the role of the federal government in establishing an economic policy. They concerned issues of taxes, tariffs, banking laws, currency reform, whether the federal government should be taxing and investing in internal improvements, roads, canals, railroads. So with the market revolution, with the industrial revolution, the now revitalized two-party system focused on these questions, these political agenda questions surrounding these economic changes. Now, admittedly, issues of banking, currency, taxes, tariffs aren't exactly sexy. They're not exactly the sort of issues that get you passionate, excited, but this was a time of intense political passion, acrimony, concern, and that's because these rather boring and banal issues of taxes, tariffs, the role of the federal government were expressed in the language of freedom. Most of the debates we've had in our history, certainly the debates that we have today in the 21st century, center on that variable and contested concept of freedom. What does freedom mean? So many key cardinal debates in American history center on that question. And in this period, when the parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, debated these issues of taxes, tariffs, currency, the role of the federal government in the economy, they rarely centered those debates on the issues themselves. Instead, they were couched in the language of freedom, the role of the government, power. And those more abstract concerns do get people excited, do get people passionate. Today, in the 21st century, when we debate healthcare policies, we're not debating healthcare policies. It's very rare to see American politicians describe the debate over healthcare in terms of healthcare. Rarely do political debates about healthcare get down into the weeds and complexities of healthcare. If they did, people would tune out, people would not listen, because it is rather complex, difficult, challenging, the complexities surrounding healthcare. Instead, when you hear politicians debate healthcare or immigration or any other political concern today, it's usually in the abstract. It's usually in the abstract language like freedom, power, success, prosperity, the things that do get people excited. And that was the case here in the 1830s when the Democrats and the Whigs debated the role of the federal government taxes, tariffs. They usually did so in the language of freedom, and that did get people passionate in this period where politics is increasingly emotional, passionate in this age of Jackson. The Whig Party, in many ways, is the heir, the legatee to the Federalist Party, and then previous to that, the ideal of republicanism. In our lectures on the American Revolution and the early government of the United States, the Federalist era, we talked about how republicanism was this ideology of this period that informed the Revolution and deeply influenced Federalists like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton that argued that freedom is possible through order, stability, a foundation by which everyone can truly feel free to pursue their own individual ambitions. Well, the Whig Party continued that. The Whig Party tended to support more government intervention in the economy in ways that were first advanced by the Federalist Alexander Hamilton. Yeah, let's have taxes that can generate revenue to invest in internal improvements. Yes, the federal government should tax foreign goods, tariffs, to protect domestic industry from foreign competition. That was the position of the Whig Party concerning these issues, these economic issues of the industrial era and the market revolution. And they argued that such actions, a national banking system, an effort to establish a coordinated economic policy that applied to all states, this would create a foundation by which freedom is possible. So here's a good example of how, when we're talking about economics in this period, we could discuss these economic concerns of taxes and tariffs and internal improvements, infrastructure, in the language of freedom, in a way that, again, is very consistent with that ideal of republicanism we saw in previous lectures. Creating a stable economic order, managing the economy, investing in infrastructure, levying taxes and tariffs, all this could promote freedom, opportunity, prosperity, a foundation by which America could prosper. That was the position of the Whig Party, which inherits that tradition from the republicanism of the 1700s that inspired the American Revolution, the Federalists, and now the Whigs. Jackson's party, the Democratic Party, at least in language and rhetoric, in a moment will show how this was not necessarily the case in reality. I'll shock you by demonstrating that politicians often didn't do what they said. I know it's very shocking, hard to imagine such a thing. But in at least rhetoric, the Democrats tended to support ideals that go back to liberalism, Lockean notions of limited government, individual rights, that later influenced the revolution and manifest in groups like the Anti-Federalists, who we talked about in our study of the origins of the Constitution. That tradition was voiced here in the party of Jackson when they argued for limited federal government intervention in the economy. States should have greater governance rather than the federal government dictating policies. They did not believe that the federal government should steer the economy in certain directions, like towards industrialization. Remember, Jackson's base of support came out of the South. He himself was a Southerner from Tennessee and slave owner. And as we've talked about in previous lectures, the South is not interested in this period in industrialization. It's not interested in a factory system. Instead, it's committed to slave-based agriculture. And so it often did not support tariffs because tariffs were designed to support American industry from foreign competition. So as a result, Democrats in the South in particular were very critical of the Whig argument for a federal economic policy. Democratic Party saw this as a threat to individual liberty, a big government, an interventionist government, a government that chooses winners and losers by trying to steer the nation towards the interest of the North, of industrialization. And so these were the different policy positions, platforms of the two parties now in the second two-party system, Democrats and Whigs. And though these concerns were about the economy, taxes, tariffs, banking laws, the role of the federal government, as we've seen here, in our effort to connect these positions to earlier doctrines like liberalism and republicanism, the debates here between the two parties about these economic issues were often couched in the language of freedom. Ironically, though, Andrew Jackson, the first Democrat elected to the White House, would, in his first term, take a stance in favor of a more interventionist federal government. So on the previous slide, I noted that in rhetoric, Andrew Jackson and his party, the Democratic Party, tended to be the party that was very suspicious about federal authority. But now that Andrew Jackson is president, we'll see in the nullification crisis, the key crisis of his first term, how he ironically became a strong supporter and enforcer of federal authority. The story of the nullification crisis is a story of a clash between Andrew Jackson and in particular southern states over the issue of the tariff. And in that clash with southern states, ironically, considering Jackson as a Democrat, owes his support to, in many ways, the South. And as we talked about on the previous slide, the Democratic Party that he helped founded was often very suspicious of federal authority. In this episode, in this drama, the nullification crisis, he'll come out in favor of enforcing federal law and dictating to states. The nullification crisis concerned tariffs. In 1828, an election year, the last year, months really, of John Quincy Adams' presidency, the U.S. government reaffirmed, reestablished a tariff law that was again designed to protect American industry from foreign competition. A tariff is simply a tax on foreign goods. When foreign goods would be imported, they would be subject to a tax, which would mean the price of that good went up, and therefore you were more inclined to buy the cheaper American-made industrial good, the American manufactured good. That's the way tariffs are supposed to operate. They're supposed to protect domestic industry from foreign competition. And so in 1828, that election year, John Quincy Adams signs this into law. Southerners hated the tariff. And when this tariff law was signed into law, Southerners referred to this tariff as, quote, the tariff of abominations. That's a good example of how something as boring and banal as a tariff could be now elevated into a question of good and evil. In the earlier slide, I said that in this period when people debated taxes and tariffs, they often expressed those debates in very idealistic, lofty language of freedom, in this case, good and evil. Southerners called this tariff the tariff of abominations, as if it crawled out of Satan's asshole. It's so evil, right? That gives you a good idea about how tariffs could be expressed in this way of good and evil. The reason why Southerners did not like the tariff, saw it as evil, a tariff of abominations, is again a story of the divide in this nation that we've talked about between North and South. The North is rapidly industrializing in the 1820s. It's shifting from a farm-based agricultural model to a factory-urban wage labor model in ways that, again, we described. The South, though, is on a very different path. It is becoming more committed than ever to slave-based agriculture. So tariffs are designed to reward industrialization, protect American factories from foreign competition. But in the South, there aren't any factories. So this seemed to favor the North. A tariff is a tax on imported goods. If Southerners buy those foreign goods, they're being taxed, but all the benefits go to the North, to northern industrialists, northern factory owners, who are thereby protected from foreign competition as their goods are cheaper for American consumers. So Southerners pay the tariff. In this period, Southerners are becoming very wealthy. This is a period. The rise of the planter elite, the very first millionaires in American history, again, in ways we talked about in a previous lecture. The age of white gold, King Cotton. So Southerners have a lot of money, and they're buying a lot of imported things, fine things imported from Europe. And so they pay the tariff when they buy these foreign goods, but they receive no benefits. And so they wanted to end the tariff. Then later in 1828, Andrew Jackson is elected president. And that seemed to be a green light to getting rid of this tariff. When Jackson is elected to his first term in 1828, the man here, represented here, becomes his first vice president. The man represented here is John C. Calhoun. And John C. Calhoun was a wealthy slave owner, cotton planter from South Carolina. And he ran and became Jackson's first vice president. Calhoun, like many wealthy Southern planters, wanted to get rid of the tariff. They're the ones who call it the Tariff of Abominations. And they believe the chance to do so is now right there at their fingertips. Jackson won. He's a Democrat, and the Democratic Party was the party that did not support tariffs, did not support the federal government intervening in the economy in this way. The vice president is John C. Calhoun, a man who represents the interest of wealthy slaveholders in the South. And so Calhoun wanted to put pressure on Jackson to get rid of this tariff. But surprisingly, Andrew Jackson says, no, I'm not going to work to overturn this tariff law. Now, why would Andrew Jackson do that? Why would Andrew Jackson, himself a Southern slaveholder, a man who was suspicious of this idea of the federal government intervening in the economy and dictating policies, particularly in a way that was against the interest of Southerners, why would he not support getting rid of the tariff? Well, in this lecture, as we now examine Jackson in office, there's an easy way to understand why Andrew Jackson does what he does, even when it is so contradictory to his party and the philosophy of that party. The easy way to understand why Andrew Jackson does what he does is to remember that Jackson does everything he does with an eye for what he believes is in the interests of the common man. Now, in our most recent lecture, we talked about all the ways in which Andrew Jackson was very appealing to poor, property-less, non-property owning white men who could now vote in this age of universal white manhood suffrage. He was an Indian killer. He was a self-made man, born poor, who rose from rags to riches. He was a general, a war hero, a tough guy, a man's man, the type of guy who will challenge you to a duel and kill you if you flirt with his wife. So we've already demonstrated that Andrew Jackson owes so much of his support to poor, propertyless white men who rally around Jackson as their leader in this new age of universal white manhood suffrage. And because of that, Jackson said, I want to help those people who voted for me. Remember, as we also learned in our recent lecture, Jackson stylizes himself and his party as the party of the little guy, the party of the common man. He's the one who argued for too long wealthy elites like John Quincy Adams have been in charge, and they've run the government in their interests. So that's why Jackson refuses to get rid of the tariff, even though there's all these indications that he, like Calhoun, would like to get rid of it. Jackson understands what's happening here. When his vice president, John C. Calhoun, and other wealthy Southerners put pressure on him to get rid of the tariff, he knows what they're up to. He knows that if they get rid of the tariff and save that money, he knows that if they don't have to pay tariffs anymore when they buy imported goods, they're going to have a lot more money. And what are they going to do? Buy up more land and more slaves and expand their power. And that's not in the interest of the common man. Because Jackson wants to make sure that little guy, that common man, the people who came out and supported him, have a chance themselves to be landowners and potential slave owners. So if guys like Calhoun, rich guys, get more and more money and more land, that's not in the interest of the common man. And so Jackson says no. He stands up to his vice president and says, no, I'm not going to get rid of that tariff. Calhoun says, oh yeah? Well, we down here in South Carolina, where I'm from, we're not going to pay the tariff. We're going to nullify it. Nullification, this term you see at the top of this slide, this episode in American history, the nullification crisis of Jackson's first term, refers to states basically putting fingers in their ears and saying, neener, 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 we don't see your law, we don't hear your law, we're not going to follow your law. We here in this state, in this case Calhoun's own state of South Carolina, are going to nullify the tariff. Just pretend it doesn't exist. We're going to challenge federal law, and we're not going to abide by, we're not going to follow federal law. And again, this is coming from Jackson's own vice president. This is supposed to be his buddy, his ally, his right-hand man. And yet Calhoun is refusing to obey federal law and the dictates of Andrew Jackson. Now, is Andrew Jackson the type of guy to challenge? Of course not. Jackson responds to this with the Force Act, which authorizes him as president to send the army into any state that refuses to follow federal law and force them at gunpoint to, in this case, pay their tariffs. So you challenge Andrew Jackson, he's the type of guy to challenge you right back. You flirt with his wife, he puts a cap in your ass, all right? And that's what happens here in the nullification crisis. Calhoun challenges Jackson, and Jackson responds with the Force Act, which authorizes him as president to use the military to force states who are going rogue in this fashion back into obedience, subservient to federal law. Federal law trumps state law. Federal law is supreme. That's the Constitution. That's the way the government is set up. Yeah, states have a lot of power, a lot of authority, but in the end, states are second to the federal government. And so you have the Force Act. But this is a very revealing episode in American history, not only because it demonstrates some of the contradictions, ironies of the Jacksonian era, that even though Jackson was a Democrat and ostensibly opposed to federal intervention in the economy, in this case, he is responsible for forcing states in line with federal authority. But it's also a revealing moment because you see a clash here between the federal government and what we may describe as slave power, the growing political power of the South, the growing political power of wealthy planters like Calhoun. After this confrontation with Jackson, Calhoun will resign from the vice presidency and go on to serve in the U.S. Senate, a senator from South Carolina, and he will emerge as the leading voice for what we may describe as slave power, the interest of slave-owning planters like him. In our earlier lecture on the antebellum South, we talked about how the great power brokers in American politics in this period are slaveholders from the South. And soon, in lectures to come, we'll talk about a growing consensus, a growing argument in the North, that we don't have a democracy, that in the end, the small cadre of planters, wealthy Southerners, get what they want. And we'll see how that plays a crucial role in building a divide between North and South and leading to a civil war. So this is an incident that foreshadows where we're going in many ways in this class, this clash between the federal government and what we may describe as the growing political and economic power of the South. So, in the end, Calhoun backs down and accepts what Jackson is determined to enforce under the Force Act, federal authority. Tariff law stays in place. Now, Calhoun resigns from the vice presidency as he has emerged now as in many ways a disloyal antagonist to Jackson. But he'll go on to serve in the U.S. Senate, and in doing so really voice the interest of slaveholders in the South in a period where there will be a growing divide between North and South, and a growing consensus in the North that wealthy planters like Calhoun dominate American politics. And then, in 1861, we'll see another clash between the federal government and the interest of slave owners in the South upon Lincoln's election. And that will go very differently than the nullification crisis, because in the nullification crisis, Southerners eventually got in line. They accepted federal authority. But just 30 years later, when Lincoln sworn in, these states will refuse to obey Lincoln as the head of the federal government, and they will secede from the Union, break away from the United States in an effort to form a separate sovereign nation to preserve and extend slavery. And the very first state to secede from the Union South Carolina, the home state of John C. Calhoun. So the nullification crisis, an interesting and revealing incident that does foreshadow where we're going in this class. A sectional divide between North and South is widening in this period. And though in this instance the divide will be cemented over as the South ultimately falls in line, in the decades that follow, that sectional divide will widen between North and South and eventually lead to a civil war. We talked in our first lecture on the Jacksonian era about the limits of thinking of this period as an era of Jacksonian democracy, a phrase that used to be quite common in history textbooks. The folly and many mistakes made in thinking about this as a period where America becomes more democratic. We've already developed that idea, the limits of this as an age of democracy. Yes, more and more people can vote because we ended the property owning requirement to vote, and that meant that all white men could vote. But we also know that means that if you're not a white man, you still can vote. If you're a woman, a Native American, an African American. Another good example of how this is anything but a period of greater democracy, story of Indian removal. The effort in the Jacksonian era to forcibly remove tens of thousands of people from the borders of this country in order to make way for whites appropriating their land. Whites who coveted that land in the West and in the South because of the trends that, again, we've talked about in recent lectures. The market revolution, the advent of commercial farming, seeking land in the West that you can use to farm surplus crops that could be sold for cash. And in the South, the rise of the cotton kingdom. The great profits that come from owning slaves, cultivating cotton, meant more pressure on land. And with that, in 1830, Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law, which called for the forced expulsion of tens of thousands of Native Americans in parts of the Southeast, the heart of the Cotton Kingdom, in an effort to secure that land that they had lived upon for thousands of years, ancestral lands of Native Americans, to make that land available for, again, the group that Jackson stylizes himself as the champion of, propertyless, poor white men. So I made this point earlier in this lecture. In order to understand what Andrew Jackson does, whether it's the nullification crisis, standing up to wealthy Southerners, or in this case, Indian removal, he does what he does because he believes this is in the interest of the common man. And you have that now with Indian removal, where some lose their freedom, lose their land, in order for that group that Jackson sees as his constituents, the people he's there to serve, and the people who, as we talked about in our previous lecture, are imagined to be citizens of this nation, only those who can vote, white men, in order for them to secure their land-owning ambitions. The group of Native Americans who were to be removed, forcibly expelled from the United States, told emphatically that they could never be Americans, were known as the 5 civilized tribes. And they were known as such because many of them, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, had learned English. Many of them had converted to Christianity. Many of them were slave owners themselves. This is a shocking element of American history, that Native Americans often owned African American slaves because, as we learned in a recent lecture, Southerners saw their slave society not as evil, but instead as highly civilized, as the apex of humanity, the way that all human civilizations should be ordered. To be civilized was to own slaves and profit off their labor, in the mindset and mentality of Southerners in the early 19th century. And because of that, Native Americans who wanted to be recognized as civilized, to be accepted as equals in civilized society, sometimes owned slaves. And so they were known as the 5 civilized tribes because they had followed that script. They had followed the script written for them regarding what it meant to be civilized as defined by the majority white American society. Speak English, worship Christ, be good little private property owners, and in the South, own slaves, because Southerners tended to think of owning slaves as not only civilized, but the most refined form of society. And that's important here because with Indian removal, Native Americans who were seen as civilized were still told it doesn't matter if you speak English. It doesn't matter if you worship Christ. It doesn't matter if you're a good private property owner. You'll still never be one of us. Now, early in the class, we talked a lot about this discourse of civilization, a body of texts and representations that come out of the colonial period, where Europeans represented Native Americans as not civilized because they were not Christian. That was the initial rationale, justification for wars of aggression against Native Americans, enslavement of Native Americans, dispossession of Native American land. It was also, as we talked about, the justification for initially the Atlantic slave trade. But we noted in those lectures that over time, that discourse of civilization that once hinged on religion, that defined status, whether or not you were civilized or not, in relation to religion, would shift towards something fixed, unchanging, immutable, race. And here, that idea of a race-based society where identity, who's civilized and not, is a function of something you cannot change, the color of your skin. Once again, that's very apparent here in the story of Indian removal, because these Native Americans, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, the other members of what were described as the 5 civilized tribes had converted to Christianity. They had learned English. The Cherokees, one of these tribes, had a constitution written word for word based on the American Constitution. Talk about following the script. Talk about mimicking American society. The Cherokee had a constitution that was written and drafted based on the American Constitution. We speak English. We worship the same God. We have the same form of government. And yet, according to Jackson and many Americans who supported this action, they were not civilized. They were savages, the term that Jackson used. So Indian removal represents many key trends. Certainly represents economic trends. We want that land, so we're going to remove Native Americans. Land coveted in a new economy of the market revolution and the Cotton Kingdom. It also represents, again, how in this period that sometimes is described as a more democratic age, an age of universal white manhood suffrage, some are included and others remain excluded, truly demonstrating why we should not call this a more democratic age. All white men can vote, and in that same period, Native Americans are forcibly removed, told emphatically, you'll never be one of us, and you're not even fit to live within the borders of our nation. And then finally, it clearly repudiates the assimilationist argument or project that had urged Native Americans to adopt what were imagined to be the traits of civilized life: Christianity, English, a republican form of government under a constitution. Here's very clear evidence that it doesn't matter what Native Americans do. They're always to be judged in relation to race, in what is clearly a race-based society where all white men can vote and those who aren't white men cannot. The story of Indian removal. Now, the Cherokee Nation, one of the 5 civilized tribes subject to Indian removal, will attempt to stop this. And they will do what civilized people do when there's a dispute: go to court. The Cherokee Nation tries to stop Indian removal, and it takes its case all the way to the highest court in the land, the U.S. Supreme Court. In a series of cases that appear before the Supreme Court in the 1830s, and the U.S. Supreme Court rules that Indian removal is unconstitutional, that Native Americans have land rights, the Constitution applies to them even if they're not citizens of the nation, and you can't just arbitrarily take away their land. Jackson hears this and says, too damn bad, I'm going to do it anyways. The Supreme Court has issued its ruling. Let's see them enforce it. Those are 9 guys on a bench with robes. I'm the president. I have an army. And so Indian removal goes forward even though it was declared unconstitutional, even though the Cherokee Nation won when they had their day in court. The result was something known as the Trail of Tears. By the late 1830s, those Native Americans who did not voluntarily exit were forcibly marched along a trail that eventually arrived in modern-day Oklahoma. The Oklahoma Territory was known as the Indian Territory in this period, and it became this dumping ground for Native Americans who were forced off land within the United States. So you have this great tragedy, this great atrocity in American history, the forced expulsion of people off their land that they had held for, again, hundreds, maybe thousands of years, that members of that Native American tribe had lived on that land. Even though they were, again, English-speaking, Christ-worshiping, land-owning Americans. They were marched along this Trail of Tears. Many died in transit. They lost their freedom, their land, and many lost their lives. So much for the idea that this is a more democratic age. Jackson would be reelected in 1832. He first wins the White House in 1828 and is reelected in 1832, and in his second term, he turned his attention to what he saw as the greatest threat to the interest of the common man, the Bank of the United States, what he declared to be the monster bank. Now, again, throughout this lecture, I've stressed to you that Jackson does what he does, whether it's Indian removal or the nullification crisis, because he believes it's in the best interests of the common man. In his second term, he went after the Bank of the United States also because he believed that it was a threat, an enemy to the interests of the common man. Now, the Bank of the United States central bank had been established first by Alexander Hamilton in the earlier period we discussed of the Federalist era, where he sought to create a central banking system that could again foster economic growth, steer the nation towards industrialization, allow banks to borrow from each other, in many ways stabilize the very unstable early economy of the United States. But Jackson was very suspicious, not just of a central banking system, but what he saw as the role of bankers, financiers, people he called as non-producers. He said they don't make anything. A farmer, a laborer, an artisan, someone in a factory, they make something tangible, real. What does a banker make? What does a financier make? All they do is make deals and profit off the labor of the real producers in the country. Jackson was also very suspicious of paper money. He said, how could a piece of paper be worth anything? He didn't have the sophisticated monetary understanding that we have today. Instead, he believed in hard currency, gold and silver. He believed those are real because you can hold them in your hand. They are more valuable than a piece of paper. So for all these reasons, Jackson decided to veto the charter, the agreement between the U.S. government and the Bank of the U.S., thereby abolishing that central banking system. He took the money that was deposited in that central bank and distributed it to what were known as his pet banks, because they were going to do whatever Andrew Jackson demanded. So he takes all the money that was once consolidated in the Bank of the United States in Washington, and he distributes it to these local banks. It became known as his pet banks because they're going to do whatever he says. They're his little pets. This is sort of an idealized idea of a pet. Ideally, if you tell your dog to sit, it sits down. If you tell your dog to roll over, it rolls over. But if your dog is anything like my dog, when you tell it to sit, it licks its balls and walks away, right? Well, at least in an idealized way, your pet does what you tell it to do. And in this case, they were known as his pet banks because they were imagined to do whatever Andrew Jackson told them to do. And in this case, he told them to loan the money out, not to people already with capital and resources, but to loan money out to, anyone want to guess? Yeah, that's right, the common man. Andrew Jackson destroys the Bank of the United States, destroys the central banking system, redistributes money through loans to common men, the kinds of guys who voted for him, propertyless white men, so that they could get a loan and buy a shop, buy a farm, participate in the new economic age. In 1836, Andrew Jackson could have run for a third term. He certainly would have won. He had come in, removed Native Americans from the South and the West, opening up lands to his constituency, the common man. He had stood up to wealthy Southerners over the tariff issue, and he had destroyed the Bank of the U.S. and put money in the pockets of the common man. But instead, in 1836, he said, no, I'm not going to run for a third term. I'm going to follow the tradition first established by George Washington, our first president, who could have run for a third term, but he elected not to. And ever since Washington did so, subsequent presidents who were very popular in their second term have hewed towards that tradition. Franklin Roosevelt finally upends that tradition in 1940 when he runs for an then unprecedented third term. But prior to that, everyone followed the model of Washington, and Jackson does that. He leaves office in 1836, triumphant, having come in and, in his mind, succeeded in these efforts in the interests of the common man. He stood up to Calhoun and wealthy planters on the nullification crisis so that they could not consolidate their land and wealth and power. Jackson also presided over the forced expulsion of thousands of Native Americans, which again he imagined were in the interest of the common man, albeit common men like him, white Americans. And then he put money in your pockets. Instead, in 1836, the Democrats nominated Jackson's second vice president, Martin Van Buren. Jackson turned to the American people and said, if you want to keep the Democratic Party in power, vote for my vice president, Martin Van Buren. Van Buren wins in 1836, is sworn in 1837, and then the country would descend into a massive depression, the Panic of 1837. Without a centralized bank, there was widespread speculation. Without a centralized bank, these small local banks doled out money to people who really didn't have the means to repay the loans, common men. All this leads to an implosion of the banking system and the country descending into one of the greatest economic disasters in our history, the Panic of 1837, which in many ways is a very true way of describing this. You know, today we have these much more clinical terms for economic downturns, recessions, depressions. Our economy is depressed. It just doesn't feel good today. But in the 19th century, in the 1800s, they called them what they were, panics, because everyone friggin' panicked like we're seeing right now. So the term panic may come back into vogue because it is so apt and accurate. But the term Panic of 1837 is also misleading because it seems to indicate that, well, this happened in 1837, but no. As we'll talk about not just now, but in lectures to come, the Panic of 1837 would linger on well into the early 1840s, like depressions tend to do. So this is a period of unemployment, factories closing, foreclosures, bankruptcies, all the hallmarks of, again, economic malaise and misery. Jackson, while this is occurring, is retired, living on his plantation in Tennessee, the Hermitage, and all this falls in the lap of poor Martin Van Buren. So, the Panic of 1837. Let's now talk, as we wrap up our look at the Jacksonian era and transition to the next period in American history, about the consequences of this debilitating economic disaster. Let's start with the immediate effects of the Panic of 1837. Poor Martin Van Buren. He's the guy in charge when everything goes to hell. Before you enrolled in this class, you probably knew something about Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory. There you see him on the $20 bill, at least for now. He was supposed to be removed, but the Trump administration, President Trump loves Andrew Jackson. You can draw your own conclusions why based on these lectures. The Trump administration has stopped briefly the removal of Jackson from the $20 bill. He soon will be replaced, minimized on the bill by a very different figure from American history, Harriet Tubman, who will someday, hopefully, replace Jackson on the $20 bill. But for now, when you go to the ATM, get your $20 bills, there's Andrew Jackson. So likely you've heard of him, seen him, know something about him even before you enrolled in this class and endured these last 2 lectures. Martin Van Buren, anyone hear about it? Yeah, right. Nobody knows much about Martin Van Buren. You don't get his birthday off. He's not on our currency. And that's because the poor guy was in charge when everything went to hell, and he incurred the blame for it. When the country descends into this massive depression, everyone blames the guy in charge. That's usually what happens. The guy in charge bears the blame, even though the policies that led to the Panic of 1837 started with Jackson. And this crushes the previous popularity of the Democratic Party, who had come in after the corrupt bargain of 1824 and really became the dominant party in American politics, rallying around Jackson, the party that really tapped into the energies, possibilities of this new age of universal white manhood suffrage. And now they look weak and vulnerable, centered on the party of Martin Van Buren. And the Whigs are standing on the sidelines hearing opportunity knock. Now's our chance to win back power or to defeat the Democrats who had previously seemed so powerful and ascendant. And in the midterm elections of 1838, the Whigs gained seats in Congress, and then in 1840 they set their sights to the White House, nominating in 1840 a man who in many ways is the Whigs' Jackson, William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison was a war hero. He too rose to fame in the War of 1812 in the Battle of Tippecanoe. He was a general, a war hero, an Indian killer, defeating Tecumseh and his forces in that fateful Battle of Tippecanoe that would open up land in the Ohio River Valley to white men. So he's the Whigs' Jackson. He's the nominee of a party who is also trying to tap into this new period of universal white manhood suffrage, win over such voters. When Harrison runs in 1840, he runs bragging that he was born in a log cabin. That's why the election of 1840 is known as the Log Cabin Campaign. Remember, another part of Jackson's appeal was he was born poor, common man, who had rose from rags to riches. Well, now the Whig nominee in 1840, challenging the sitting Democrat, Martin Van Buren, says, I was born in a log cabin. Now, Harrison was a millionaire, a slave owner, but he wanted you to not focus on his wealth, instead focus on his humble beginnings. So he in many ways represents that new style of politics that Jackson helped inaugurate, now being used against Jackson's party, the Democrats, when the Whigs nominate their Jackson, a general, war hero, Indian killer who brags of being born in a log cabin. Harrison will win the election of 1840, and more about that in lectures to come. For now, though, we could see this as another consequence of the Panic of 1837. The Democrats were now blamed. They were in charge and everything went to hell. And that led to the ascendance of the Whig Party, who in 1840 will nominate their Jackson, who so represents this new style of politics, and become the very first Whig ever elected president, although his presidency will be a very brief one for reasons that, again, we'll talk about in lectures to come soon. Those are the short-term impacts of the Panic of 1837, how it changed American party politics, led to the defeat of Martin Van Buren, the declining popularity of the Democrats. The long-term effects are, of course, even more consequential and crucial to our understandings as well going forward in this class. The long-term effects of the Panic of 1837 come from the fact that many Americans mired in this depression, many Americans who are in the grips of all of these terrible effects, high employment, bankruptcies, foreclosures, will look for a panacea, a solution, a cure-all, something to make the economy vibrant and strong again. How can we go back to that period of prosperity before all of this happened? And for Americans, that panacea, that cure-all, that solution that will restore the economic power of this nation, whether they're Northerners or Southerners, will be westward expansion. What happens is that Northerners say, well, what we need to do to revitalize the economy is claim more land in the West, build railroads, commercial farming, the market revolution. all of those elements of the northern economy. Southerners will say, yeah, we got to expand westward and expand cotton. And so both sections of the country, in a time period where, as we've seen in this lecture and previous lectures, the sections are dividing, will both look to the west for a solution. But with that firm faith that our future, a brighter America, an end to this panic will come with westward expansion, will come a debate. Whether that land out west will be open to slavery or closed to slavery. And that will have key consequences for where we're going, key consequences in American history.